Shalom, dear friends. Wonderful to be with you. It's a joy to be with you from our studio here in the hill of the Jerusalem. And we've been very busy this week. We are going to the Christian Media Summit, and it was wonderful, busy, and it's wonderful to see this cooperation that's happening more and more between the Jews and the Christians. You know, Israel government is really realizing that the media, the Christian media, is a force to really speak the truth all around the globe. So it was wonderful. And today in the studio we're having Shelley Nees.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. Shelley comes from Washington, and she wrote a beautiful book which is called The Copper Scroll Project, and we're going to speak about it. It's on Amazon now, and it's been released
October 30th, so it's out in 2 weeks. This is an early copy, but it's available.
Okay. Because I already saw people who wrote your book, and there is already people saying, yeah, this is a great book.
I think that's because you can get it on Kindle and Nook and kind of the online version first, but the official launch is October 30th.
Oh, so you see, we are just at the beginning. Wonderful, wonderful. So, Shelley, you are the vice president of TGCI. It's the Jerusalem Connection International, and it's really to teach people about Israel, support Israel, and making people knowing more about Israel. This is wonderful. Right. From Washington.
Right.
Yes?
Yeah, no, we just feel like so many Christians by their instinct and by their gut support Israel and love Israel, but we want to educate and activate that instinct just so that they're better informed advocates for Israel.
Wonderful. And you have 4 beautiful children.
I do.
This is wonderful. And so you wrote this book, and I was starting to read it. I tell you, guys, it's like an adventure book, a bit like the Lost Ark,
right.
But this was like the Lost Copper Scroll.
Right.
So tell us a bit how you've been involved in this adventure.
Right. So I have been writing this book for 10 years, but mostly because I was following this amazing story for 10 years. I met Jim Barfield 10 years ago. He's the one who the book's about. He's the explorer, or the Indiana Jones of the story, the protagonist. And sometimes, I started off writing it as one article, and then one article turned into 2 articles, and then a longer one, and then I realized this story is so much bigger and so much grander than just an article. So that's when I never wanted to write a book. I never intended to. It's my first book. So that wasn't really my intention, but I mean, sometimes stories come along and they find you, and that's what I felt like. I was the only one that knew it, and so I felt like I was the only one that could tell it.
Mm-hmm. And it's beautifully written, like I was starting to enjoy. And not only that, you speak about this adventure, we are going to speak a bit more about it, but you really put also archaeological find, and so it brings knowledge for the people more about Israel and what's happening here, knowledge of the people too, how the things works in the archaeological world, because it's kind of tricky. So tell us a bit more of when this started.
Right.
And the adventure, and where it's going then.
Sure. Yeah, when I wrote it, I mean, I really assume no pre-knowledge on the part of the reader. I want to be the teacher. I want to walk them through mostly teaching about first century Jerusalem and this time period that the Dead Sea Scrolls were birthed in and that they come from, because that's where Christianity comes from. That's where Rabbinic Judaism as we know it today comes from. And so we cannot know enough about that time period in order to understand our Messiah, in order to understand the Bible. So the Dead Sea Scrolls are already such a gift in that way. And the copper scroll in the face of it is not a great teaching tool. It reads like a dry inventory. I mean, it reads like you're just reading a list that has no verbs or no action. But so it's more of just putting the copper scroll in its correct context and using a little bit of imagination, but also the other historical documents that we have or oral traditions. And so I'm trying to puzzle and piece that together in the book so that readers can come to their own conclusions about where the copper scroll comes from and possibly what it's related to. That's what I'm doing. But I will tell you that all scholars agree that the copper scroll is a real and authentic document. And it sounds crazy to say this is a 2,000-year-old treasure map, but there's no argument. It is a 2,000-year-old treasure map. And what the copper scroll is pointing to, it's a list, so it's pointing to, it starts off and it reads like, in the valley under the ruins, at the steps pointing eastward, 40 cubits are 17 talents. And so it's always just telling you where to go, where to look, how deep to dig, and how much gold or silver you will find. I mean, you can't make this up.
I know, it's like a treasure map.
It is absolutely, it's a verbal treasure map. So it's not a treasure map, you know, with an X on it, but it's a verbal treasure map of over 60 locations that the person who's inscribing the copper scroll is leading you directly to it. But that's actually what makes the copper scroll so difficult, is that it is specific to the time period that it was written in. So when it says things like, go look in Matia's courtyard, we don't know who Matia was. We don't know where her courtyard was or what city. And so it almost was like they were writing a private note to themselves, so that when they buried the temple treasures, or I'll get to that later of why I think it's related to the temple, but when they came back to look for them, these were notes to themselves. These were reference notes to themselves. So it's really hard coming in 2,000 years later and trying to do that guesswork. But that is where the story of Jim Barfield comes in. So he's an arson investigator from Oklahoma. He plays that humble card a lot. He was an internationally recognized and awarded arson investigator. He was good at it. But he just looked at the copper scroll with a little different logic. And like I told you, where it starts off in the valley under the ruins, most people just associated that with the first hiding spot. You know, so if there's over 60 hiding spots, that's the first hiding spot. But he said, I think that's the preamble for the whole thing. I think actually all 60 plus of these locations are in the valley under the ruins. And so he selected Qumran and said, this is the most obvious ruin in the valley of Acor. And so let's see if the descriptions in the copper scroll match the architectural remains that we have of Qumran. The scroll starts off, stairs facing eastward that measure 40 cubits. There are stairs facing eastward that measure 40 cubits.
In ruins.
In ruins. You know, the Qumran...
Yeah, it's all ruins.
If Qumran wasn't connected to the Dead Sea Scrolls, no tourist would go to it. You know, it's not a visually appealing site like En-Gedi or Masada. We go to Qumran because it's associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls. This was an austere community. They don't even have mosaics or anything nice really to look at. We go there because of our connection to the Dead Sea Scrolls. So what better community than these austere Essenes? Potentially, we don't know. I mean, the book is trying to connect these dots, and it's a little bit of leaps of logic sometimes, but it makes sense to me, just like you get a eunuch to protect your concubine. You know, maybe you would pick these people who have sworn off any wealth to hide the temple wealth whenever the Romans were coming, or whatever time period.
They were very strict.
Very strict, right? So strict on purity, as if they knew and understood that something was special about their community. Still connected to Jerusalem and their love for Jerusalem, but definitely had been outcast from Jerusalem. It's hard to know exactly what was going on. There's a lot of guesswork among Dead Sea Scroll scholars, but if we can get closest to any community, it's probably the Essenes, because we have their rules that they lived by. That's a gift that we usually don't have that are associated with ruins.
That's true. Now, for people, when was the scroll found?
Sure, 1952. So, 1952. You know, the original Dead Sea Scrolls, the ones that we associate with the earliest 7 that were found, that was 1947. So it took a few more years that Bedouins were combing the desert, but archaeologists were combing the desert too. It was a few years of just a race to find, and the black market was being flooded with fragments. They found Cave 4, which had thousands of Dead Sea Scroll fragments. And so usually the Bedouin won that race. They're the kings of the desert. But in this case, it was Cave 3. It was the third cave found, and it was archaeologists who found it. I should say with the help of a Bedouin team, but it was an official archaeological excavation sponsored by the Jordanian Department of Antiquities, which is why Jordan has the scroll. So that's an important piece.
Oh, so they are in Jordan?
The copper scrolls in Amman, Jordan. So it's not with the rest of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They have a picture of it in the Shrine of the Book in the Israel Museum. But as far as I know, it doesn't even tour outside of Amman, Jordan.
So how, again, I'm very ignorant.
Sure.
I haven't read all the book. What's happened with the copper scroll? I mean, like, because you wanted to read them, and they were, if I remember,
rolled up.
That's it, rolled up.
For 2,000 years. Right. So there's rivets on the edges of the copper scroll on the 4 corners. So what we think is that it's actually two roles. So when the archaeologists found them, just the finding of the copper scroll is amazing. They were excavating Cave 3. They were disappointed in what they were finding because they could tell that it once housed many, many scrolls. There were but the ceiling of the cave had collapsed in antiquity, crushing the jars that were protecting the scrolls. So most of the Dead Sea Scrolls that were in cave number 3 were fragments. They were buried in rat nests around the caves, totally destroyed, except for a few scrolls that they were able to find in good condition. So they were closing up the dig, literally only hours left that they were willing to give to this cave. And they see what looked to be a false wall in the back of the cave in a different chamber. A lot of these caves, we speak of as they're one cave, but a lot of them are multi-chambered caves. Mm-hmm. And so they decide to just give it one last look. And they realized that it was a limestone it was a niche. It was a niche, and on it looked like what was a man-made shelf behind this rock that they chipped through, and they see 2 copper rolls. They were green. I mean, the cover of the Statue of Liberty, because they had oxidized over time, and they had never found anything like it. There's no other Dead Sea Scroll that's written on copper. They're all papyrus or leather, but there really is no other ancient metal document at all except for the copper scroll. So it's really fascinating. It obviously broke in two during antiquity, probably when they were rolling it up. It snapped, and so it was once one, but now it's two. For 3 years, it sat in a museum in Amman, Jordan. They couldn't figure out how to open it. Who would dare touch it? They risked this beautiful scroll that we didn't yet know what was inside of it or what its contents read, and it would crumble at the slightest touch. So John Allegro was a member of one of the Dead Sea Scroll editorial team. He really is the one that first championed the copper scroll. Everyone else was so busy trying to piece together these tiny fragments that were coming out of the Negev desert all of the time and out of the Judean desert. So what he did is he brought it to his alma mater. He brought it to Manchester University. He went to London. He was able to find someone that was willing to open up the scroll, really someone just in the College of Engineering. It wasn't a metallurgist, an expert in ancient metals or anything. It was someone with a little bit of guts and ability. He made a really crude device. There's pictures of it in the book. I mean, it makes me nervous now even to look at the pictures of, and he did it alone. He told John Allegro, Henry Wright Baker is the name of the man who opened up the scroll. And he told John Allegro, meet me back tomorrow morning. He had developed the device to cut it, and we'll cut it. But really, he did it that night because he says in his writing that if he had shattered it, he wanted to be alone in his own misery. But it worked, and he cut it into 23 steps, and that's why we can read it today, and that's why we know it's a treasure map.
Wow. Now, I know that there was also some excavation in 2009. Mm-hmm. So with JAMP, what was it for?
Right. So Jim Barfield was able to. So he's in his hometown of Lawton, Oklahoma, and he's in his study, and he believes I have found the key to the copper scroll. He makes a 250-page investigative report. He's moving forward, and he's doing the work, not knowing who he can tell or who he can contact. It's a long story how he actually
because he was an investigator, so
yes.
It's like he had a certain way of thinking.
He had to map it out. He had to do the translation work. The 250-page report has aerial maps. It has, graphics. He was doing it for himself as much as he was to be able to present to any antiquities authority, but really had no contacts in Israel, no archaeological, anything in his world. And that's the part where really just God and it sort of starts moving and bringing people in, and so the book will reveal all of that. But what I will say is that he does get a meeting with the Israel Antiquities Authority pretty quickly, actually, and he meets with them, and pretty quickly after that they decide to test his research. And so they do several probes, about 6 probes in the Qumran ruins and 1 site outside of the Qumran ruins, which is associated.
Him and them.
Him and them. He is observing. He's providing the research, but it was them doing the dig. He's not an archaeologist, and so it was their names on the permit, and we got stopped. And for years, I really didn't know why we got stopped. Things were going well. Our archaeologist was telling us, don't worry, I have Olympian patience, because really the problem is that the copper scroll tells you to dig, but not just dig, to dig deep. Okay. And that's not archaeology. That's actually treasure hunting. Archaeologists dig to the last level of human habitation. So it was really going against their own practices and what they believed. And we really needed technology. We needed technology to be able to say, Jim Barfield could say that the copper scroll was pointing to somewhere along these stairs or somewhere along this perimeter wall, but without knowing exactly where to dig. And we're talking about the copper scroll usually says to dig 8 to 12 feet down. So that's past the last level of habitation. That's not archaeology. That's not comfortable for them. So it began to push that envelope too much. Also, some American archaeologists started calling and putting pressure on the situation. It was a lot of drama and intrigue and politics and bureaucracy and all of those things that get involved.
So when you think about that, is archaeological, so they do like with the little brushes and everything. But when you speak about treasure hunter, it's like you have to find a metal detector.
Right. So this took years. That's why this book has been, 10 years in the making, because it became very clear that we would Qumran is a sacred site as it is. It's associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's now a closed archaeological site. You're not allowed to even dig in Qumran. We were one of the last times to do it. So that became the problem. Once they closed Qumran, it was already a problem when the excavation was going on that was becoming clear to us. This is going to look like a close-up shot of the moon if we, dig these 12-foot pockmarks at 60 different locations around Qumran. This will never work. And so, but really, the metal detectors that the Israel Antiquities Authority had, they were normal, kind of cheaper metal detectors that really didn't even work in the mineralized soil around the Dead Sea Scroll area. They were picking up things like the metal part of the archaeologist, the toe of his boot. It was just very unsuccessful. It was a very small metal detector. So we were able to get actually a $10,000 Lorenz metal detector, but this comes on much years later. I mean, part of archaeology sometimes now is waiting out the technology to be able, now we can do archaeology from the sky, we can do aerial scans. But this is different. This was bringing in a special metal detector that we could adjust to look for large objects, look deep, be able to adjust to the mineralization of the soil out in the Dead Sea area. And so that happened. It's a lot of also more drama, more intrigue, political figures get involved. And so the site was scanned in a very unorthodox way. And what we can say is that we scanned 6 of the 60 sites, and there was a positive read. Actually, one read that was so positive, I tell people it looked like Fort Knox. It was testing positive for something large and something non-ferrous, which means gold medal or gold, silver, or bronze. And we're stuck. And we're stuck, because what do you do with this information? It was a member of Knesset that did the scan. It wasn't a permitted scan. And so for 2 years now, we've sort of lived in this hold of, we didn't want to tell the archaeologist associated with this. We'd get them in trouble.
I heard about the story.
Yes.
I saw an article about it. I was like, oh my gosh, what are they doing? But they weren't doing it just in Qumran. They were going somewhere. Sorry. I haven't heard about Qumran, but like 2 years ago I heard about somebody doing it, and I won't say the name, somewhere near Eilat. And I'm pretty sure that it was connected. Together. Yeah, and I'm like, oh, okay. So guys, it's written in the book. There is a lot of information in the book. It's just amazing. So, okay, we don't have so much time. What's happening with the Sanhedrin? Because I know the Sanhedrin is like rabbis who are connected together, and especially also about the Temple Mount. There is also the Temple Institute. So is there something moving on with them about that? Right.
So for years, word started to leak out about the Copper Scroll and about how it was connected to temple treasures. And we all know, with what's happened recently 2 years ago with UNESCO kind of changing the language to sort of de-Judaize Jerusalem and the Temple Mount. So there became a little bit of a desperation we have evidence of the outside of the walls of the temple, of the courtyards of the temple. Archaeology has proven that, but we actually don't have anything from the interior of the first or the second temple. So what they want a banner to march under, and the Temple Mount movement has become tethered to the Copper Scroll Project in that way, is that archaeology can assist in that fight, and archaeology also can can sort of appease what we now see as happening as Temple Mount denial. And so that's why we have lots of friends and allies in the Temple Mount movement that have been willing to help and been willing to get involved.
Mm-hmm. Which is interesting again to see, like we were speaking about the Christian summit, media summit, and like Jews and Christian working together, it seems God is doing it. And like the same for that, it's like Jim is a Christian working with the Jewish people, and there is like, it's like you can't do without them and they can't do without us. It's amazing
and
to see.
that's my favorite part of the story. More than the treasure, more than the archaeology, it's the human part of this story that I love the most. Mm-hmm. Because that's the passion that we both have to see that through.
I know. By the way, Shelley was with us also during the Christian summit, the media. So what is it? Just stop totally, or do you carry on doing some work, expecting something more to move later on?
So what we decided to do was instead of letting just leaks come out about what happened, about the positive scan at Qumran, about the member of Knesset who was involved, instead of letting that leak to the press, we decided to just wait. And once the book was published, just inundate the media with this information now and hopefully call for grassroots action just to test it. We're just asking for one site to be tested. We're not even asking for Qumran, the interior of the ruins, because we realize the trickiness of that situation and the sanctity of the site. But we are asking to dig at one spot outside of Qumran, and we're hoping for a grassroots movement to demand action. It's not a problematic site that we want to dig at.
So maybe next year, during the Christian media summit, maybe we might hear, because we were speaking, maybe we should have more archaeological things at that time. And because it touched the world. It doesn't just touch Israel. It's like consequences, universal consequences of all of these things.
Right, and that's how the Copper Scroll has informed my faith, and that's just what I hope it does for other people, is that archaeology is just one more tool that we can use to grow in our own relationship with God and to inform the way that the Bible is a historical and reliable document, but that these were real people living in real places, and that there may have been a covert operation to save the temple treasury when we knew the Romans were knocking at the door. And so that's what I'm hoping, is just that it'll help people's faith journeys too.
This is amazing. So, we were speaking today about the Copper Scroll Project, amazing book. You can find it on Amazon very soon as a copy like that, because you can find it already. That's it. You can already find it on
Kindle and Nook and those things.
Listen, thank you very much,
thank you.
Shelley, for speaking about that. You see, this is like hot off the press, and Shelley is going to speak to other media people in Israel, but I'm sure also
starting here.
Yeah,
it's starting
that's
here.
it. Starting in Israel. You're very right. And in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem, we love to say more and more Yerushalayim, because it's what's happening. And you might have known they just find like a stone where the name of Yerushalayim is written, which is about 2,000 years, I think. And they say, look, we are saying the name of Yerushalayim, Jerusalem, like that. Look, is written that way. This is our place. We are living here. We are not moving. And this is happening about Israel and the Jewish people. They came back and they are finding all this treasure here. Shelley, thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. I hope that you really enjoyed this program. And we'll see you next week. Bye. Shalom, dear friends. We carry on looking at the name redemption. Do you remember Geula? We've learned already this name. And we look at that redemption is a process. It's a personal process, but it's also a collective process. It's also for Israel, but it's also for the world. And the name world in Hebrew is Olam. So we can see the return of the people in the land. We can see the building of the land again. And also, we can see the renewal of the Hebrew language. And the Hebrew language is Ivrit in Hebrew. So they were coming, all the people were coming from all around the four corners of the world. They were speaking many different languages. There was German, French, English, and so many others. And Eliezer ben Yehuda came in 1801 and said, now we need to renew the language, not just for our prayers and not just in our book, but to speak day to day Hebrew. So he was a journalist, he started a newspaper, and he was creating new words and giving to the people to say, hey, do you like this word? So he's done bicycle, he's done tomatoes, all names weren't in the Bible and was really new name for them. Now, in 1948, obviously, the State of Israel was declared, and so a lot of people, hundreds of thousands of immigrants were arriving in the land, and the Jewish agency had to organize some schools, some language school, and they were called Ulpan. Ulpan in Hebrew means studio. It was special. It was like with a group of people, and they were learning together. This way of learning is still used now, and it's a fast pace, and it's like together as a group. So it's like there is a dynamic which is very good, and people learn quite quickly the language. Hebrew is not always easy to learn. So we look at few names today. We look at the name world, which is Olam. We look at the name Ivrit, which is for the language. And you know, Abraham was called the first Hebrew and is Ivri. So Abraham was the Ivri, and it comes from the verb le'avor, is crossing over. Abraham was the first one who said, I want to believe in the Creator, the one Creator. So Ivrit is Hebrew, comes from le'avor, and like Abraham was the Ivri, Ivri. So this is the word again that we've learned today. Olam, the world, Ivrit, the Hebrew, and Abraham was Ivri, the Hebrew man. Bye, and we'll see you next week. I hope that you enjoyed this program. I did. Thank you, Shelley, for this adventure that you gave us. If you want to order the book, you can go to shelleynees.com, and you can order the book there. And from Shelley and from me, bye, and see you next week.